Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
West, the Wild West, cowboys and buffaloes and untamed land, territory, American territory.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn. What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Tracy K. Smith. She is the 22nd U.S. Poet Laureate. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you.
What did you think? Is this your first time to Wyoming?
Yes, and I know it won't be my last because I've just been so captivated by the beauty. It's incredible. I mean, I've just been in one place here in Jackson, and the trees and the mountains and the air and the sense of new life and spring is just so beautiful. And I know the history here is very rich, so I would love to come and just think a little bit more in this place and see what that might yield.
Oh, good. What was your impressions about Wyoming before you came?
Well, I thought of like the West, the Wild West, cowboys and buffaloes and untamed land, territory, American territory. And I guess my knowledge sadly kind of stopped there, so it just seemed like a place that would maybe be an opportunity to see what part of this country looked like before strip malls and, overdevelopment. And that feels true, at least here. But I don't know much else yet. Oh, that's interesting. Where have you traveled in other places around the United States? Oh, gosh. Well, as Poet Laureate, I visited Kentucky this past spring and New Mexico and South Carolina, North Carolina. I grew up in California. I've spent a lot of my life and did my schooling on the East Coast, Massachusetts, New York. I live in New Jersey now. This is kind of like a part of the country, the mountain states, that I just have never, I've flown over, but I've never had the opportunity to kind of touch down in. So it seems like a big unknown in my imagination.
Right. And I welcome you, and I hope you come back for sure.
Thank you.
How do you get chosen to be the U.S. Poet Laureate? What kind of process is that?
Well, I don't know. It's one of those things where a decision is made and you're called and asked if you're willing to do this. I now know there's an office that supports this, the Poet Laureateship. I know the Librarian of Congress is involved in making the decision, and there's also support from this office that I think is thinking about possible people who might be willing to take on the role. I also am working with the staff in the Poetry and Literature Center of the library on developing each of these trips that I've been doing and that I'll continue doing over the next year, which is to visit rural communities in different parts of the country where there may not be literary programming happening on a regular basis.
What did you want to be when you grew up? Did you see yourself as a poet, living your life as a poet?
Well, my first professional wish when I was a kid was to do something like poetry, but I remember learning about philosopher kings when I was in school and thinking, oh, okay, they write poetry, they think about justice, they govern, that sounds great. And I came home and I told my brother, and he said, you're going to have to think of something else because that doesn't exist anymore. And I knew I loved writing, and I thought maybe I could be a journalist. Maybe that would be a way to live with this, love of language. And then I got to college, and I realized there were poets who were out there writing and reading and teaching, and I knew that was what would make me happy.
And so was your degree in literature?
English and African American Studies.
Oh, okay. And so then from there, what was your journey into poetry?
Well, I started taking the poetry workshops at school, at college, when I was a junior, and going to poetry readings as often as possible. And after college, I spent a year back in California. My mother was going through the end stages of a terminal illness, and I needed and wanted to be there. While I was dealing with this overwhelming, upheaval, poetry was a huge anchor for me. Reading poems, listening to recordings of poets reading their work, and writing my own. And so I knew that I needed to find a way to make that central in my life. And so I got an MFA in creative writing from Columbia, and from there just kept going down this path that's been long and bending, winding, but so deeply fulfilling.
I bet that's interesting for your children when they have to explain what their mom does for a living.
I don't think it's so. It was interesting for my dad,
Okay.
who said, "Oh, what are you gonna? How does that work?" And then I remembered the moment that he felt safe in this decision, and he started saying, "This is my daughter, the poet." When he would introduce me, my kids don't know any better, So
Right.
they say, "Oh yeah, my mom writes poetry. My mom's going somewhere to read poetry," and that's just normal to them, which makes me very happy.
Well, exactly, because then it opens their eyes and opens the windows of their mind to learn more and experience more.
Yeah.
What is one of your favorite poems that I want you to read for us?
Oh, okay. Well, a poem of my own.
Yes. Or even one you have from memory.
Oh God, I wish I had some poems from memory, because I love, one of my favorite poems in English is George Herbert's Love 3, and I used to have it by memory at one point. It begins, "Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack, drew nearer to me from my first entrance in." And there I begin to know I've messed up some of the lines, but that's a poem that I love and revere. I have my most recent book with me, so I'll read one of my own poems, if that's okay.
Yeah, I love that.
I'll read you one that's also thinking about love. That might make a good sort of connection between those two voices. This is the title poem, "To Wade in the Water." And it's set during a ring shout that I attended, which is an African-American tradition that involves performing the old spirituals. And I went to a performance in Georgia, and one of the women who was about to go into this room and sing said, "I love you." She gave me a hug, and I just felt so undone and enlarged and healed by that gesture. And I observed her say that to everyone she met that night, and I was so moved that I wanted to revisit that night. Wade in the water. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her, and a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you, I love you," as she continued down the hall, past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. "I love you," throughout the performance, in every hand clap, every stomp. "I love you," in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag, until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. "I love you," in the water, where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. "I love you," the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes in those beams of light that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel, knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Is this love the trouble you promised?
That is beautiful. I love that your
poems have stories, that they have stories that go with them. And I was reading some of your poetries, and I didn't realize that the one that you were talking, that was that you wrote after David Bowie's death, that was him. And I kept going back to try and find that thread. So that's interesting. And if you don't know the history of maybe and someone reads one of your poems, how do they find the thread of where did she?
Well, I hope there's enough going on the surface of a poem that even if you don't know the backstory, you can get something out of it. Something is built that seems visual or that you can feel through your senses, and language becomes a presence. I hope that happens. But then I think, okay, my poems often utilize kind of conventional sentence structure, and so there's an idea that runs through. I like the ways that poems can obey something other than logic, which I think is true for life. Sometimes you wake up from a dream that has made perfect sense, but it hasn't unfolded in a logical way. Like you look in the mirror and you're somebody else, and you round a corner and you're in a different place, and yet in a dream we kind of trust this somehow. I think poems make similar kinds of departures or leaps by thinking associatively. So you can be thinking about a feeling or an experience and then leap in the next line to a related feeling that sits in a very different context. So I hope that a reader might be willing to surrender a little bit of the need for a linear logic and say, I'm moved, I'm transported by these other events in the poem.
And that is very true, because when I read it, I knew it was about someone's death. And I was going back to think, oh, I think that's her brother. Or that's someone she loves. That's what that feeling, the poem gave to me. And so, no, it doesn't have to be linear.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing.
Because that essence was still there.
Yeah, and I feel when I'm reading poems by other people that I know they often come from precise or specific experiences in perhaps the poet's life, but they speak to things that have happened to me too. And so they provide me with a different vocabulary for maybe it's loss, or maybe it's love, or maybe it's being in a different place, that strangeness. And so some of my own experience gets grafted onto the poem. So it becomes less important whether it's the poet's brother or the poet's sister, and somehow it becomes an opportunity for me to think about my brother or my sister.
Right. And so you don't really have a theme in your poems. Like, it's not just about social justice. It's about feelings and places you've been and nature, and just how do all those things come to you to say, I want this to be a poem?
Well, I invite everything that's of importance or interest to me as a person into the poems that I write. And so sometimes an idea or a conviction is what brings me to the page. Other times it's just something I've seen, something that I've felt that feels special. I sit down and write a poem to kind of figure out what that special thing is made of, to figure out how close I can get to it, and maybe what else I can come to discover about why it has moved me.
And you love the power of words, obviously.
Yeah, I do.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's great to talk to you.
And come back.
Okay, I will.
Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.